hopefully we'll have a video covering the rear wing design sometime next week.
Well, it's a long story. Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of my OpenRC F1 2022 design series. Today I'll be explaining the process for the wheel rim design, the STLs for which can be found at the link below. After that, I'll also be giving a sort of preview / update, showing how the project has changed and explain why it's taken so long to make part 2. And with that, let's get on the way. To start, I needed to select a suspension design as that's what the wheels will go on. I decided to go with the current OpenRC F1 suspension as it's very well designed and it will be more compatible with the current OpenRC F1 files. I began by sketching out a tire profile. I sketched that profile out and extruded it to create a crude version of the front tire. I then added fillets to either end of the tire to better mimic the transition from the sidewall to the tread. Then I added two planes 4mm from either end. I sketched out a circle which is 2mm wider than the internal diameter of the tire and extruded it to cut grooves in the internal surface. For the wheel, I start by sketching out a profile with the outer diameter which is the same as the inner diameter of the tire. I extrude it out for the width of the tire and add two circles 4mm and 8mm smaller at the top. Then I add 10 lines within the inner circle 36 degrees apart, which will form the template for the spokes. I then added an inner circle 6mm in diameter, which will form the hub of the wheel and also act as a holder for the wheel bolt. I then trimmed the spoke lines up to the hub and offset them by 0.6mm on each side to form the spoke profile. The reason I chose 0.6 was that the eventual spoke thickness would be 1.2mm, which any printer with a 0.6mm nozzle or a 0.4mm nozzle will be able to print without having to offset the printing lines and weaken the spoke. Now that that's done, it's time to clean up all leftover sketch profiles and extrude the spaces between the spokes to create a crude wheel rim. I added a 3mm hole that runs down the length of the rim and filleted the edges of the spokes. I then got around to profiling the outside of the rim by adding a triangular sketch to one of the spokes and using the revolve tool to cut the spokes. But oddly enough, it seemed that the cut was off-center. After a few minutes of trying to work out what was going on, I realized that putting the sketch on the surface of the spoke offset the whole revolve by the thickness of the spoke, or 0.6mm, thus making the revolve off-center. So I went back and created an offset plane that would be at the center of the spoke to redefine the sketch plane on, and then the sketch and revolve worked out perfectly. I filleted the sharp edges and then moved on to the locking grooves I put in the tires. For this I added two planes 4mm from either end of the rim and sketched out two circles 2mm larger in diameter to the rim. Then I extruded these circles for 2mm each. Moving on to the inner side of the rim, I repeated the same sketch and revolve to cut out part of the rim, and this time I added a small cylinder to the hub. This is an adapter for the front axle which will assist in keeping the tire aligned. I then trimmed down the wheel nut section and filleted the sharp edges again. This is more to help with printing well, as vertical fillets do not need supporting so that the wheel prints fully supportless. I also chamfered the locking grooves so that they fit easier when I assemble the tires. The next part is designing a covered wheel. The new regulations state that teams must use wheel covers to reduce the wake from the tires, which is a shame because I love the new wheel rims. So I have provided an option to print either the bare rim or the covered one. But back to the design, I simply sketched and extruded a circle 2mm thick over the top of the rim. This keeps the internal geometry, which is important for structural integrity as well as providing the cover necessary. Anyway, that was the front wheels done. Now for the rear ones, there's not a lot of change except for tire dimensions. The front wheels are 27mm wide while the rears are 40.5mm wide and 62mm in diameter. This required a few adjustments to the sketches that were used to define the initial tire dimensions and the tire grooves as well, but that was it. The tire design seemed to be complete. I then printed the front and rear suspension assemblies and two tires and the two front rim options to test the fit. At first I thought the fit between the tires and rims was good, and the tires, although hard to get on, were a great fit. Then I test fitted the tires to the suspension, and that's where the problems became apparent. See, The design I had that put the wheel bolt all the way from the outside of the rim into the axle also relied on the bolt to hold the rim in place, causing the wheel bolts to come undone the moment the wheel rotated. That's when I realized that to fit the suspension, the wheel nut design has to be the same as the original. To fix this, I went back and did a few iterations. I resized the inner hole to fit the bearings and removed the wheel nut. While the rims did fit, even with the wheel bolt on the wheel, it kept falling off. Then I took a closer look at the original front rims and realized there's a constricted section in the middle that separated the axle and the bolt, which I had missed. I added that and also reduced the bearing slot diameter to check if the earlier fit was correct. And it turns out the earlier bearing fit was spot on, and the new construction also did the job of keeping the wheel nut separate and the wheel in. I corrected the bearing slot diameter and also reprofiled the rim cut angle because I want to be able to fit the original front axle, which was designed for a much thinner wheel, and also it looks really good. For the rear rims, I did a similar thing, but instead of cutting a circular hole, I put in a hole that was the same shape as the rear axle, which required some fun sketch geometry. I then printed out these rims and test fit them to the suspension, and they work great. Now, for the update. Around the time I began completing the initial wheel iterations, I downloaded the step file from the OpenRC F1 Thingiverse page. This contains CAD models of all the original parts and would be the perfect way to test fit components. That's all that I had in mind. But I realized that the rear wing I had designed would not be compatible with what was on the step file. And also, I had the idea of rebuilding the chassis since the flat floor would no longer be there in the new regulations. So I have rebuilt the floor with ground effect aero in mind, and the rear end now assembles in a slightly different way. But more about that in the next episode. I won't be promising any release date as that didn't age well the last time, mostly due to me having to fully redo the video editing after figuring out the issues with the initial wheels. But I'm trying to find as much time as possible to complete the design and edit videos. Also, if I complete any element of the design, I will release them to the My Mini Factory link in the description before the videos, so I'd advise keeping updated there. I've already updated the front wing to be much lighter and more flexible. And that's the end of this episode. I'd like to thank everyone who commented and messaged me after the first video for the kind words and the encouragement, which gave me the momentum I needed to keep going with the series. So, until next time, goodbye.